It began with a murder. In the early days of SAMCRO, Teller Morrow Automotive served as both a legitimate business and the hub of the club's operations. One quiet evening, as JT and Piney were working late, the piercing sound of a gunshot shattered the calm. JT burst into the main garage, his boots crunching against broken glass. There, sprawled on the concrete floor, was Chico Villanueva, blood pooling beneath him. "Jesus Christ," Piney muttered, his voice thick with shock as he stepped in behind JT. Chico's kudu was gone, ripped from his body. His face was twisted in pain, frozen in death. "Who the hell would do this?" Piney growled, his fists clenched. JT knelt beside Chico's body, his expression grim. "Someone's sending us a message, and they want us to know it's personal." The first 9 gathered at the clubhouse that night. The air was heavy with tension as JT addressed the group. "Chico's gone," JT said, his voice steady but low. "Shot execution style in our own garage. Whoever did this wasn't just looking to send a message. They wanted to hit us where it hurts." Piney slammed his fist on the table. "This doesn't add up. Chico wasn't just some random patch. He knew things. About us, about the shipments we've been running." Clay Morrow leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Maybe someone thought Chico was talking too much." The room fell silent. Lenny the pimp Janowitz, ever the voice of reason, spoke up. "You're saying this was one of us?" "I'm saying we can't rule it out," Clay replied. JT shot Clay a hard look. "Chico was family. I won't believe one of us would turn on him." Keith McGee, always the strategist, folded his arms. "If it wasn't one of us, it was someone who knows us, our roots, our habits. This isn't just about Chico. It's about what we're building." "Then we find out who it was," JT said firmly. The investigation began quietly. Lenny used his connections in Stockton to dig into rumors of rival clubs moving into the area. Meanwhile, Clay and Piney questioned local businesses that had dealings with SAMCRO. It was Otto Lil Killer Moran who brought the first lead. "I heard something down in Modesto," Otto said, lighting a cigarette as he leaned against the clubhouse bar. "There's a new crew trying to muscle in on the gun trade. Small time but ambitious. Call themselves the Black Ravens." "Black Ravens," Piney repeated, spitting the words like venom. JT nodded. "If they're trying to cut in on our business, that's motive enough. Let's pay them a visit." The Black Ravens operated out of a dingy warehouse on the outskirts of Modesto. The first 9 rode in under cover of darkness, their headlights cutting through the gloom. JT held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. "We do this clean," he said. "No collateral damage, just send a message." Clay grinned. "Got it, boss. Loud and clear." The Sons stormed the warehouse, their guns drawn. Inside, they found the Black Ravens loading crates of weapons onto a truck. The air erupted with the crack of gunfire as the two groups clashed. When the dust settled, the Sons stood victorious. The Black Ravens were either dead or fleeing into the night, but it wasn't over. JT found a ledger among the wreckage, a record of transactions that included names, dates, and amounts. And there, scrawled in black ink, was a name that chilled him to his core: Chico Villanueva. Back at the clubhouse, JT confronted the remaining members of the first 9. He tossed the ledger onto the table, its pages open to Chico's name. "Explain this," JT demanded, his voice cold. Piney leaned over the ledger, his brow furrowing. "You're saying Chico was dealing with the Ravens?" "Looks that way," JT replied. "But why?" Keith McGee asked. Lenny spoke up, his tone somber. "Chico had debts, gambling. He might have thought he could cut a deal to get out of trouble." JT slammed his fist on the table. "He was supposed to come to us! We're family!" "Maybe he didn't think we'd help," Clay said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Maybe he didn't trust us." JT shot Clay a hard look. "Or maybe someone pushed him into it." The room went silent. Suspicion hung heavy in the air, threatening to fracture the club's fragile unity. Days later, Otto uncovered the truth. Chico hadn't just been dealing with the Black Ravens, he had been blackmailed by them. They had threatened his family, forcing him to provide intel on SAMCRO's operations. But the betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Otto returned to the clubhouse with news. "It wasn't just the Ravens," he said, his voice grim. "Someone tipped them off about Chico's debts. Someone inside." The accusation landed like a thunderclap. JT turned to the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his brothers. "Whoever you are," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you've got one chance to come clean. Otherwise, I'll find you myself." No one spoke. The tension reached a boiling point. The first 9 were no longer united. Distrust seeped into every interaction. Late one night, as JT sat alone in the garage, a shadow moved behind him. He turned, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. "Who's there?" he demanded. A figure stepped into the light, their face obscured by the brim of a hat. "We need to talk." the figure said. The sound of a gun being cocked echoed through the garage. John Teller didn't flinch, his hand steady on the grip of his pistol. The shadowy figure stepped closer, the dim garage light revealing his face. Keith McGee, his expression grim, sweat beading on his forehead. "Keith?" JT said, his voice a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What the hell are you doing sneaking around here in the middle of the night?" Keith raised his hands, palms outward, but didn't put down the gun he held. "I didn't have a choice, John. We need to talk, alone." JT narrowed his eyes. "You've got 2 seconds to explain before I put a bullet in you." Keith sighed heavily, lowering his weapon slightly. "It's about Chico and the Black Ravens. There's more to this than you think." The two men sat across from each other in the garage, tension thick in the air. Keith lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his eyes darting around as if the walls themselves had ears. "Chico was weak," Keith began. "We all knew that. He was drowning in debt, trying to keep his family above water. The Ravens saw that and used it against him." "You're not telling me anything I don't already know," JT said coldly. Keith exhaled a cloud of smoke. "What you don't know is how they got to him in the first place." JT leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Spit it out, Keith." Keith hesitated, his voice faltering. "It was Clay. He's the one who gave the Ravens Chico's name." The words hit like a sledgehammer. JT froze, his mind racing. "Clay," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You're saying Clay sold out one of our own?" Keith nodded. "He saw Chico as a liability, figured he could use the Ravens to handle the problem, keep his own hands clean. But things got messy. Chico panicked and, well, you know the rest." JT stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "You knew about this and didn't say a damn thing?" "I didn't know the full extent," Keith protested, standing as well. "Not until after Chico was dead. By then I was trying to keep the peace." JT's eyes burned with fury. "This isn't peace, Keith. This is betrayal. And if Clay's behind this, he's got blood on his hands." The next day, JT called an emergency meeting of the First Nine. The room was tense, the air crackling with unspoken accusations. Clay sat near the head of the table, his usual cocky smirk in place. "What's this about, JT?" Clay asked, leaning back in his chair. JT didn't waste time. "It's about Chico, and how the Black Ravens knew exactly where to hit him." Clay raised an eyebrow. "Thought we already figured that out. Chico had debts. He made his bed." JT slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Don't play dumb with me, Clay. Keith told me everything. You gave Chico's name to the Ravens. You're the reason he's dead." The room erupted into chaos. Piney shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "Is this true, Clay?" Clay's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice steady. "Chico was a liability. He was gonna get us all killed." "You don't get to make that call!" Piney roared. "I made the call to protect the club," Clay fired back, standing. "Chico was weak, and in this life, weakness gets you killed." JT drew his gun, pointing it directly at Clay. The room fell silent. "You don't get to decide who lives and who dies," JT said, his voice trembling with rage. "This club was supposed to be about brotherhood, about loyalty. You broke that." The First Nine convened in private to decide Clay's fate. It was a tense and bitter discussion, with the group divided on what punishment fit his betrayal. Lenny was the first to speak. "If Clay sold out Chico, then he can't be trusted. You break the code, you pay the price." "Death's too easy," Otto said, his voice cold. "We strip him of his patch, exile him, let him live with what he's done." Piney shook his head. "If we let him live, we're showing weakness. Clay's already proven he'll do whatever it takes to get ahead. What's to stop him from doing it again?" Keith, guilt heavy on his face, said quietly, "We need to think about the future of the club. Killing one of our own will tear us apart." The room turned to JT, who had remained silent. Finally, he spoke. "We vote, majority rules." The vote was cast, and the decision was clear. Clay would be stripped of his patch and exiled from SAMCRO. The next day, the sons gathered in the yard as Clay stood in front of them, his coat removed. His face was a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed his anger. "This isn't over," Clay said, his voice low but menacing. "You think you're saving the club by doing this? You're wrong. You're destroying it." JT stepped forward, his expression cold. "You destroyed it the moment you sold out one of our own. Now get out of Charming, and don't ever come back." Clay mounted his bike and rode off, the roar of his engine fading into the distance. Months passed and the club began to rebuild, but the shadow of Clay's betrayal lingered, and tensions remained high. One quiet evening, JT sat in his office, penning another entry in his manuscript. The soft hum of the garage's lights was the only sound, but a faint creak made him pause. "Who's there?" he called out, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a familiar figure, Clay Morrow. His face hardened, his eyes filled with fury. "I told you this wasn't over," Clay said, raising a gun. The barrel of Clay's gun gleamed in the dim light of the garage. JT sat motionless, his hand hovering near his own weapon. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken weight of their history pressing down on them. "Clay," JT said, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake." Clay's lips curled into a bitter smile.
"The only mistake I made was trusting you to lead this club. I built this with my blood, and you threw me out like garbage. You betrayed the club!" JT fired back, his voice rising.
"You put your own ambition above the Brotherhood. You don't deserve to wear that patch." Clay's hand shook slightly, his finger hovering over the trigger.
"Maybe you're right, but I'm not the only one with blood on their hands, John. Don't act like you're some kind of saint." JT's eyes darkened.
"I've made my mistakes, but I've never turned on my family." For a moment, it seemed like Clay might lower the gun. But then, the sound of roaring engines broke the silence. The Suns were coming. The garage door rattled as the bikes pulled up outside. Clay's eyes flicked to the sound, his face twisting with frustration.
"This ain't over, John,"
Clay hissed, backing toward the exit. "Not by a long shot." JT didn't move, his hand still near his gun. "You come back here again, Clay, and I won't hesitate." Clay slipped out the back door just as Piney and Lenny burst into the garage, guns drawn. "JT!" Piney barked. "You all right?" "Yeah," JT said, though his voice was tight. Clay was here. Piney's face hardened. What the hell was he doing here? JT didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the door, staring into the darkness where Clay had disappeared. "He's not done with us," JT said finally, "and we need to be ready." Days later, the Suns received word that Clay had resurfaced, not in Charming, but in Belfast. The kings of the IRA had taken notice of his ambition and were willing to fund his revenge against SAMCRO in exchange for loyalty. "That son of a bitch," Piney muttered during the meeting. "He's trying to turn the Irish against us." JT nodded grimly. "If Clay gets the backing of the kings, he'll have the resources to come at us hard. We can't let that happen." Lenny leaned forward, his voice calm but intense. "We've got connections in Belfast. Maybe it's time we reminded the kings who their real allies are." JT, Piney, and Lenny flew to Belfast under the cover of night, leaving Keith McGee to handle the Charming chapter in their absence. The plan was simple: meet with Connor Malone, an intermediary for the kings, and reassert SAMCRO's loyalty to the Irish gun trade. But when they arrived at the arranged meeting spot, a decrepit pub on the outskirts of the city, they found chaos. The pub's windows were shattered, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Inside, Connor was slumped over the bar, blood pooling beneath him. "Jesus Christ," Piney muttered, his hand reaching for his weapon. "This wasn't random," JT said, his voice low. "Clay's already been here." From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Cormac O'Shea, a high-ranking member of the IRA and Galen O'Shea's younger brother. "Welcome to Belfast," Cormac said, his thick Irish accent dripping with disdain. "You're late." JT stepped forward, his posture tense. "Cormac, we didn't come here for trouble, we came to talk." Cormac smirked, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Talk? That's funny, coming from the likes of you. Your old pal Clay's been doing plenty of talking himself. Told us all about how SAMCRO's gone soft." "Clay's a liar," Piney growled. "You know that." "Do I?" Cormac said, tilting his head. "Clay's offering us more money, more loyalty, and more ruthlessness than you lot ever have. Why should we keep dealing with you?" JT took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because Clay only cares about himself. He'll promise you the world. But the second you stop being useful, he'll sell you out just like he did us." Cormac seemed to consider this, but his expression remained guarded. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time for new blood in Charming." JT took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You back Clay, and you're declaring war on SAMCRO. And I promise you, Cormac, that's a war you won't win." The Suns left the meeting without a clear answer. Cormac had promised to consider his options, but JT could see the writing on the wall. Clay's influence was spreading, and the kings were starting to waver. Back in Charming, things weren't any better. Keith McGee had been acting strangely, his behavior erratic and secretive. Piney confronted him in the yard one evening, his tone sharp. "What the hell's going on with you, Keith?" Piney demanded. "You've been acting like a damn ghost since JT left." Keith hesitated, his eyes darting to the clubhouse. "I'm just trying to keep the peace, Piney, that's all." "Peace?" Piney scoffed.
Or are you just covering your own ass? Before Keith could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air.
A black SUV tore into the lot, its windows down. The first gunshot rang out and chaos erupted. Bullets sprayed across the lot as the Sons scrambled for cover. Abel Teller, who had been cleaning a bike nearby, ducked behind a stack of tires, his heart pounding. From the SUV, masked gunmen poured out, their targets clear, the Sons of Anarchy. Keith McGee stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his eyes wide with fear. One of the gunmen pointed a rifle at him and shouted, "This is for Clay!" Before the trigger could be pulled, a shotgun blast rang out, and the gunman fell. Piney stood on the clubhouse steps, his weapon smoking. "Keith!" Piney shouted. "Get down!" But Keith didn't move. Instead, he turned and ran toward the SUV, disappearing into the fray. From his hiding spot, Abel watched in shock. Did Keith just... The SUV sped off, leaving behind a trail of carnage and unanswered questions. As the Sons regrouped, Piney turned to JT, his face pale. "John," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think Keith just betrayed us." JT stared into the distance, his jaw tight. "Then it's not just Clay we're fighting anymore." The roar of approaching engines echoed in the night. Reinforcements? Enemies? The faint roar of approaching motorcycles grew louder, blending with the echoes of gunfire that still lingered in the air. The Sons stood in the lot, weapons drawn, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. Piney clutched his shotgun tightly. If it's Clay's people, we're not waiting for him to make the first move. JT raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Hold your fire. Let's see who it is first." The headlights appeared, casting long shadows across the lot. To the Sons' relief, the familiar patches of the Mayans glinted in the light. At the front of the pack was Marcus Alvarez, his expression unreadable as he killed the engine and dismounted. Alvarez surveyed the scene, the bullet-riddled clubhouse, the bloodstains on the asphalt, with a critical eye. "Looks like you've had a rough night," Alvarez said, his tone calm but sharp. "You got no idea," JT replied, stepping forward. "What brings you here, Marcus?" Alvarez lit a cigar, taking a slow drag before answering. "Heard some chatter. Word is Clay's making moves, and he's not just leaning on the Irish. He's talking to some of my own men, offering big payouts to turn against me. And you." Piney swore under his breath. "That bastard's stirring up every hornet's nest he can find." Alvarez's eyes narrowed. "This ain't just your problem anymore, Teller. Clay's trying to start a war, and if he gets enough backing, he might just pull it off." Back inside the clubhouse, the Sons regrouped. Keith McGee's disappearance hung heavily over the room, casting doubt on everything they thought they knew. "Keith ran toward the SUV," Piney said, breaking the silence. "He didn't even flinch when those bastards came for us. He's in on it." Lenny frowned, his expression skeptical. "Keith's been with us since the start, Piney. Why the hell would he turn now?" "Maybe Clay got to him," Otto suggested. "Offered him something we couldn't." JT rubbed his temples, frustration etched across his face. "We can sit here speculating all night, but it won't get us anywhere. We need proof. Something solid to tie Keith to Clay." Alvarez leaned back against the bar, his cigar still smoldering. "I might be able to help with that. Clay's been meeting with some shady types up in Oakland. One of my guys got a name. Reed Langston. Former merc. Now working freelance for anyone with deep pockets. If Keith's involved, Reed'll know." "Where do we find him?" JT asked. Alvarez smirked. "He's got a hideout at the docks, but you'll need to move fast. Word is, he's leaving town in the morning." The docks were eerily quiet as the Sons approached under the cover of darkness. JT, Piney, and Otto led the charge, their weapons drawn as they closed in on Reed Langston's hideout. A decrepit warehouse with flickering lights and broken windows. Inside, they found Reed packing a duffel bag, a pistol tucked into his waistband. "Going somewhere, Reed?" JT asked, stepping into the light. Reed froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but Piney was faster. The butt of his shotgun connected with Reed's temple, sending him sprawling to the ground. "You've got some explaining to do," Piney growled, pinning Reed to the floor with his boot. Reed chuckled darkly, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "You boys sure know how to make an entrance." JT knelt beside him, his voice calm but menacing. "We're not here to play games. You've been working with Clay Morrow. Tell us what he's planning." Reed smirked. "You think I'm scared of you? Clay's paying me enough to take a beating and then some." Otto stepped forward, his knife gleaming in the dim light. "You might not be scared of us now, but you will be." After some persuasion, Reed finally cracked. All right, he spat, his voice hoarse. "Clay's been building an army. He's got the Irish, a few rogue Mayans, and even some ex-military types like me. He's planning to take over Charming and dismantle SAMCRO one piece at a time. And Keith? JT pressed. Reed hesitated, then nodded. He's working with Clay. Been feeding him intel for weeks. He thinks Clay's gonna make him president when the dust settles. JT stood, his expression unreadable. Where's Clay now? Last I heard, he's holed up in Stockton, Reed said. Big meeting tomorrow night with the Irish Kings. If you're gonna make a move, that's your shot. JT nodded to Otto, who delivered a swift blow to Reed's head, knocking him unconscious. Let's ride, JT said. The Sons arrived in Stockton just as the sun was setting, their bikes roaring through the industrial district. They found Clay's hideout, a fortified compound surrounded by armed guards. This isn't gonna be easy, Piney muttered, loading his shotgun. Nothing worth doing ever is, JT replied. The Sons moved in under cover of darkness, taking out the perimeter guards with precision. Inside the compound, chaos erupted as Clay's men scrambled to defend their leader. JT pushed forward, his focus unshakable. He found Clay in the main office, flanked by Keith McGee and a few remaining loyalists. It ends here, Clay, JT said, his gun trained on his former brother. Clay smirked, stepping forward. You sure about that, John? You think taking me out will fix anything? You betrayed us, JT said coldly. You tore this club apart. Clay's smirk faded. I did what I had to do. You're too blind to see it, John, but the Sons are dying. I was trying to save us. JT shook his head. The only thing you were trying to save was yourself. Before Clay could respond, Keith raised his weapon, aiming it at JT. You don't have to do this, Keith, Piney said, stepping into the room. Keith hesitated, his hand trembling. A gunshot rang out. Keith fell to the ground, blood spreading across his chest. Piney stood behind him, his shotgun smoking. Had to be done, Piney said grimly. Clay used the distraction to grab his gun, but JT was faster. He fired once, hitting Clay in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the floor. It's over, Clay, JT said, standing over him. Clay coughed, blood staining his teeth. You think killing me will solve all your problems? You'll never be rid of me, John. I'll haunt this club till the day it dies. JT hesitated, his finger on the trigger. John, Piney said softly. It's your call. JT lowered his gun. Lock him up, he said. Let him live with the consequences. The Sons dragged Clay out of the compound, his protests echoing into the night. Back in Charming, JT sat alone in his office, penning the latest entry in his manuscript. The words came slowly, each sentence a struggle. The roar of a motorcycle outside broke his concentration. He looked up just as the door opened, revealing a shadowed figure. John Teller, the figure said, their voice cold and unfamiliar. We need to talk.